Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming along. And so, yeah, my name is Henry McGhie. I'm now a museum consultant working on supporting museums and their partners to enhance their contributions to sustainable development agendas. So, what are these? Well, basically, any activity that helps us achieve a better balance of how society relates with the environment and the economy. But I'll talk about all that. So my background's as an ecologist, and then I worked in museums for a long time, for nearly 20 years, but then became more and more interested in the potential and the opportunity, I suppose, of museums and their partners to support sustainable development, which I'll talk about. One of the things I will keep returning to is these things that you can see on the screen just now, the Sustainable Development Goals, which you might be more or less familiar with. But I'll talk about these as well. So I set up this consultancy in 2019, Curating Tomorrow, kind of based around three kind of ideas. Firstly, that the future is not like a set thing; it's something that we build from the foundations of today. Secondly, that the museum-based skill of curating, selection, attention to detail, creating public value, attendance to real world issues, has a part to play in this. And thirdly, that cultural institutions, be they museums, libraries, archives, or whatever else, they have really a very distinctive part to play. Just trying to move forward. Why won't that work? Here we go. Okay, so the way I work is that I have a good understanding of sustainable development agendas and challenges, and I'm aware that these are quite new for a lot of people. So what I do is I write these guides that you can get for free, freely available, and you can get them from the links there. The one in the top right isn't released yet. That'll come out at the time of COP26. And so in these guides, as I say, I'm very familiar with what museums can do, what they're good at, and also some of the things that they perhaps struggle a bit with, and really look at how to line up those activities with these sustainable development agendas and approaches. And really, so what's the point of doing this? It really saves reinventing the wheel. Why would we do that? Here we have really ready-made, fantastic opportunities, great chances to work with one another and with other sectors, and that's what these guides aim to help you to do. So, as I say, they're freely available. Please make use of them. Share them as far and wide as you like. And so, but I thought I would start with this. Thinking about heritage management in the context of climate change, but also other sustainable development issues. And the reason I chose this slightly humorous cartoon is really to highlight that, well, there's very little point in having cultural institutions where the collections are all perfectly looked after, preserved, if we're in a world which is falling to bits. And so, as I mentioned with this idea of curating tomorrow, what we do in cultural institutions, of course, relates to the wider world. And there's a great saying that the context of our work is the world, and that is, I really believe, is true. That one of the best ways for cultural institutions to have a future is to ensure that they're in a safe environment, safe and thriving environment. And so this idea of heritage, it has a lot of, let's call it capital attached to it. So as we're about to embark on COP26, we'll be in Glasgow in a couple of weeks. But if we rewind back to the 1980s, this idea of climate actually as a heritage actually helped launch the whole the Framework Convention for Climate Change, which is what COP26 is all about. So David Attard is a Maltese academic, and it built on an idea that was also developed by a Maltese politician. It's a legal principle called the common heritage of mankind, accepting the gender basis of the language is that when we talk about the common heritage of mankind as a legal principle that's applied to the floor of the sea, to space, to radio waves, and this idea was to apply the same principle to climate. It didn't quite happen in the full way, in that it became that climate is a common concern of humankind. And we might think about the difference between a heritage and a concern. But I just wanted to highlight this idea that heritage and sustainability they're quite closely related principles. They're not exactly the same, because it depends which aspects of heritage we choose to think about and which ones we choose to ignore. And on that, just talking about this, we might think about how we think about heritage as perhaps a nice to have, a good to have, a global good, in comparison with waste, the things that we just don't think about or we brush under the carpet, more or less literally, or the things that we just throw away. So heritage and waste are very closely associated things, although we may not think of that in heritage management. But you may wish to think about, well, how many things that are there in museums that are today very prized and treasured, which were once somebody else's rubbish, or which were thrown away on purpose. And so this idea, climate as a common heritage of humankind, really helped set up this thing called the Framework Convention for Climate Change, was agreed in 1992. At that time, it was kind of after the time of the ozone hole. Scientists had shown that the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere was really going up very, very fast. And so there was an international agreement was set up by all of the countries, pretty much all of the countries of the world, called the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was one of the 3 outcomes of the Rio Earth Summit from 1992. So there's the Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, and there's another one which almost no one's heard of called the UNCCD, which is the Convention to End UNCCD, to combat desertification, the conversion of land into deserts. But they're very closely connected as well. And so the aim of the Framework Convention was to stop the greenhouse emissions going up anymore. You know, we need to deal with this. And then the governments, the countries that all signed up to it, they agreed to meet every year to monitor progress, create new plans to make sure that that goal was achieved. And so some of the important ones were in 1997, there was the Kyoto Protocol, which was where governments said that, well, okay, we need to have legally binding emissions targets. It didn't say what the targets were. And then in COP21 in Paris in 2015 was where the countries agreed to aim to hold global temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade compared with about 1900, but to pursue efforts to keep it to 1.5. There is a very big difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And if these things don't sound like very much, you know, what does 1 degree of warming, you know, even look like? If you can think of a kettle and the amount of energy it takes to warm a tiny amount of water to 100 degrees centigrade boiling point, imagine how much energy it takes to heat the whole world, the whole atmosphere and the seas by 1 degree. It's an absolutely huge amount of energy, and that energy has to go somewhere. Energy drives storms, floods, lots of different things. And so anyway, that's a very short potted history of the link between heritage, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the COPs, you know, and we'll be coming to COP 26 in Glasgow in a couple of weeks. I'll come to talk about that. So when we talk about, it's very common to hear people talk about climate action, but what do they mean? So I'll talk a bit about that, and then I'd like to talk about net zero, which people talk about all over the place, but is actually a rather dangerous idea if used badly. I'll talk a little bit about sustainable development and heritage management, or we could think about it in terms of that program there was on the television ages ago about what do artists all do all day? What do conservators do all day? How does it relate to sustainable development? Then we can talk about disaster risk reduction and heritage management because it's International Disaster Risk Reduction Day. I'll talk about the 10 essentials of resilience as a kind of framework that you can use. And then lastly, I'll talk about COP26 and a project I've been involved in called Reimagining Museums for Climate Action. So let's think about the heritage sector though, and how it works, and really almost the crazy way it seems to work sometimes. So these are just some issues I think there are. That there really is no holistic approach as to what institutions are needed where, or whose heritage matters, or how it is developed. We've come to have a sector which is often project-based, which results in a lot of competition. So we have competition for not enough resource. We often find that museums and heritage activities are used to drive economic growth, or as a symptom of economic growth. It's not a coincidence that the biggest museums tend to be in the biggest cities. They're a manifestation of the same thing, of inequality of capital. There's a problem of a bigger is better mindset. There are many practices that drain resources and create a lot of pollution, which we'll talk about. And really, we could think that the production and consumption of culture has become part of high consumption lifestyles. And we might think about that in terms of the disproportionate use that the middle classes make of cultural institutions. People who earn more tend to consume more. They have more money to spend on things. But this just kind of keeps that, it kind of feeds that inequality, and we can talk about that as well. And we could say that used badly, culture and heritage can drive unsustainable tourism. And we can find that most obviously in the way that the World's Heritage scheme is often used, that it creates a kind of bucket list of where people visit these places and consume an awful lot of carbon in the process. And so we might think about that as really what we could call an irresponsible consumption and production of museums and other cultural institutions. And across the top of the slide there, you'll see these the icons for the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 12 is sustainable production and consumption. We might think about what would a sustainable production and consumption of the culture and heritage look like. So unfortunately, we for good and for bad, the cultural and heritage institutions and practices we have are part of the deeply unsustainable world that we live in. So a sustainable future really requires different approaches, different institutions, different practices, but also different attitudes and commitments. So sustainable development is ultimately a mindset. It's the mindset that drives you forward to try to do this stuff. And we might also, I'd like to emphasize that while the culture and heritage sector might say, oh, well, you know, we're preserving these things for people for tomorrow, this stuff is valuable. There's really no get out of jail free card because you're looking after something precious. The climate really does not care. So we need to think about the balance of what resources are you using to preserve something, and where else is feeling the cost of those decisions. And so we might think that, well, climate action, just to go through this, really falls into, there are two actions which are really regarded as the very, you know, the kind of main planks of climate action, but there's a third one I'd like to talk about. So climate mitigation, in the context of climate action, it means reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also strengthening nature's ability to absorb them. So climate mitigation does not mean oh, we've got to mitigate the effect of climate change. That's climate adaptation. Mitigation means reducing emissions. So yeah, the second one, climate adaptation is really the actions that enable people, organizations, and nature to deal with the impacts of climate change. People have the option of making decisions that adapt to current or future impacts. Nature can only adapt to current impacts. Nature can't look into the future. But the third point to make is that there are many ways to address climate change that are very unfair, that are very unequal. Net zero is one which we'll come to talk about. So we need to make sure that any activity we're doing for climate change really, but also looks to address this climate justice, human rights, and what's called a just transition. A just transition is how we move from one economy and industries to alternatives in ways that don't just leave people basically without jobs or in stranded jobs or in left behind communities, because that just is hopeless. So we need to make sure that all of these actions are done in ways that are fair. And some of the best ways to do that are to use sustainable development approaches, because it's often a common mistake is that the Paris Agreement is all about climate change. It's really not all about climate change at all. It's really all about the system that will help us live in a world where the problems of climate change are addressed. And so I would say that there are really 5 main climate actions that cultural and heritage organisations can make. We'll come to talk about these in more practical terms later on. So mitigation action, both in our institutions and through our institutions, reducing our own emissions, but also supporting other people, other organisations, communities to reduce theirs. Similarly, taking adaptation action in our own institutions and supporting those impacted by our work to adapt in their own lives, in their own communities. And again, just to make sure that we're using climate justice and rights-based approaches throughout all of these things. So this is a kind of template I like to use for these 5 things. So this is a really complicated diagram from the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's how greenhouse gases are measured. And so they're measured in they're called 3 scopes. And so across the top of the diagram there, you can see the 6 greenhouse gases. So our planet has a natural greenhouse effect. It's a good job, because if we didn't have the natural greenhouse effect from the atmosphere, then life would not be possible. The planet would be absolutely freezing, apart from the fact we'd have no air to breathe. So we have a natural greenhouse gas effect, but that is affected when we pump different gases into the atmosphere, because they alter the atmosphere's ability to trap heat. And so the most common one is carbon dioxide on the top left. Then we have methane, CH4, which, although is much less common, is much more powerful than carbon dioxide. We have, and methane largely comes from rotting vegetation, from paddy fields, from the production of oil and gas and so on, and from stagnant conditions. Nitrous oxide is produced from the production of fertilizers and by the application of fertilizers to land in excessive quantities. It causes release of nitrous oxide. And then the 3 on the right-hand side, you're probably least familiar with, are the fluorine gases. They are very powerful greenhouse gases. And it has to be said, like in thinking of conservation practice, at least 5 of them are very evident in conservation practice. Carbon dioxide we use in all kinds of things. Methane comes from lots of things, from food waste, all of these things. The fluorine gases are mostly used as refrigerants. So any, we might think of air cooling, air handling, refrigerators, fridges, all of these things very likely contain some kind of fluorine gas. And so to talk about the bits with the arrows is how a company's emissions are measured in these three scopes. So the green arrow in the middle comes from the release of greenhouse gases on site through burning fossil fuels. That might be from burning oil or gas on site in boilers and incinerators, or in the fuel tanks of your company vehicles. Scope 2 on the left-hand side there is the emissions that are associated with the energy that you use, the electricity or the steam. So if you use renewable electricity from renewable sources, you will have much less Scope 2 emissions than if you use them that come from a coal-fired power station, for instance. But the most complicated one is called your Scope 3 emissions, and that's shown in the diagram with all the little icons. And there are 15 categories of Scope 3 emissions. And they are really, really important. They're emissions that you don't wholly control. They're your indirect emissions, so associated with all of the things that you do. And the one that I would like to draw attention to is the one that's in the right-hand side, use of sold products, because that also includes products that are distributed for free. And so use of sold products would include the emissions from visitor travel to a museum. You might think about if you're touring exhibitions, those also generate lots of Scope 3 emissions. And Scope 3 emissions are extremely important because they're typically 80% or more of a company or an organization's greenhouse gases. So Scope 1 and 2 should be really quite straightforward to reduce. You know, you move to renewable energy, sounds easy. Why do more people not do it? Scope 3 really needs some attention, really needs effort. But it's really important not to forget about it. So the easiest way to think of it is that your Scope 3 emissions are someone else's Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And so we're just trying to reduce these all the time, because at the end of the day, climate action means reducing the amounts of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. And then just to say at the bottom line where it talks about upstream reporting company and downstream, this is because this was done for the for reporting for the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Upstream activity means emissions associated with things before they get to you, whether it's energy or goods or whatever else it is. The reporting company is what happens within your four walls, and the downstream activities are what happens either elsewhere or, you know, generated through your activities. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about net zero as a really very dangerous idea. So what is net zero? We hear about net zero all over the place at the moment, about this company is going to go net zero, that company is going to go net zero. We're going to do it by planting thousands and thousands of trees. That's really not the whole story of what net zero is supposed to be. Net zero, used properly in its proper sense, means that you are contributing for the emissions that you are currently unable to eliminate. So it means that you're working hard to reduce your emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and then you offset the remainder. So it really is not an excuse to expand and then offset, because that just doesn't work, because the emissions have still gone into the atmosphere. It's not an excuse to buy your way to innocence, because all of these places where people are talking about planting trees, generally in the global south, people there have got their own ideas for how the land should be used. And net zero really shouldn't be a marketing exercise either. Or there's a thing called greenwash, which is where companies or organizations are damaging the environment, but they're kind of through a sort of almost like an accounting trick. Net zero can be thought of as an accounting trick, making claims that just aren't the whole story. So if you are talking about net zero, please do really be working hard to reduce your emissions in line with science-based targets. Do it through one of the official schemes like the SME Climate Hub, or a Science-Based Targets Initiative, or the Climate Neutral Now from Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the good thing with all of those is that they require you not only to make a commitment, but to commit to reporting, because if we are going to make statements, we should also expect to be held accountable for them. So I personally am part of Climate Neutral Now and of the SME Climate Hub. I'm quite happy to declare my emissions and what I'm doing to try to reduce them. But to return to this point again, net zero is not zero. We should be aiming for zero as far as we can, and we should work damn hard at it. And so how can all of this work? So this is, I show you this, the image on the bottom is when we had the big conference, ICOM conference in Kyoto in 2019. And by an incredible coincidence, the photo was taken from almost the same position as where the photo was taken in the top. That's when the Kyoto Protocol was signed in 1997. And the great thing with the ICOM conference was it generated this resolution about how museums would embrace sustainability and sustainable development, and they would use Agenda 2030 and the SDGs as the blueprint to do this. The problem is that those two events took place over 20 years apart. I mean, the great thing with the Agenda 2030 and the goals is they really help to break through the logjam of a world of conventions and declarations and lots of silos. The goals really help us to work much faster and much more effectively with one another, and they are fantastic. And so here we have the document. Is called Transforming Our World from 2015, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and it consists of a vision, a set of principles to work together, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as a kind of results framework, and a thing called the means of implementation, the commitment to work together in a renewed spirit of global partnership to address the world's problems. If you're not familiar with the document, I really very much encourage you to have a read of the first 35 or so paragraphs. They contain the vision. That's fantastic, because it's important to understand the goals in relation to that. It's very common to see the 17 goals, as I have in my front room here, but ultimately they're just 17 pictures. We have to understand them in the broader context of what they are trying to achieve. And I'll just take excuse me a second. And so the shorthand version for Agenda 2030 is to build a world with these, what are called the 5 Ps. People, to end poverty and hunger in all forms and ensure dignity and equality. To ensure prosperous and fulfilling lives in harmony with nature. To protect our planet's natural resources and climate for future generations. To foster peaceful, just and inclusive societies, and to implement the agenda, all of this activity, through a solid global partnership. And so this is very much like the old model of what used to be called the 3-pillar model of sustainable development: social, economic, and environmental, people, planet, and prosperity, but also recognizing that we need peace. None of this stuff is going to happen without peace. And peace is actually a natural outflow of all of this activity. And partnership is the way that we achieve different results. If we just work with the people who we have always worked with, if we just work in the same way that we have always done, we will only ever achieve the same results we always have and create the same problems we always have. So this is the kind of shorthand way for thinking about Agenda 2030 to achieve these 5 fantastic aims, and sustainable development sits at the center of these. And I think I would just like to add on to there that any discussion that claims to be about sustainability really needs to cover at least 3 of those 5 things: the people, planet, and prosperity, because it's too easy to say, oh, well, this is a project about social sustainability. unless it's all or environmental sustainability, or this is about economic sustainability, if it's not also acknowledging the impacts on the other aspects, it's maybe not a discussion about sustainability at all. And so these are the goals, 17 challenges that are shown here in summary form. So it's important to understand that to understand it properly, you need a little bit more information, at least to look at the full titles of the goals. And there are 17 goals and there are 169 targets within them, which is quite a lot. Even 17 is quite a lot. When people would say, oh, well, 17 is too many, but when we think that these are a set of 17 challenges that pretty much incorporate most of the world's big challenges in some way or another. And just to say how these are intended to be used, they're not supposed to be like a kind of bingo list where you would say, oh, well, you know, we do goal 4 and I do goal 11. So that I do goal 4 and I do goal 11. That's my bit. That's really not how it works. If we think about those 5 Ps that I mentioned before, then these 17 goals, it's a bit like a big puzzle that we're trying to balance all of these, achieve all of these things, achieve the goals by 2030 in a way that builds the world of those 5 Ps, if that I hope that makes sense. So we don't think about these goals separately, we think about them together. So to take that example further, if you were to say, oh, well, I do goal 4 and I do goal 11, great. That means that those are your access points, your entry points into the, you know, the SDG universe, the 17 goals together. And so let's think about this thing. Well, what do conservators do all day in relation to these 17 goals? I don't have time to go through them all just now, but I can assure you that your work contributes both positively and negatively to each of these 17 goals. And the reason that I know that that is true, not just because I worked in museums before, is because whether we like it or not, what we do has an impact on the world. It has both positive benefits and negative impacts. Sustainable development activity is how we enhance the positive and we reduce and aim to eliminate the negative. And the distance that we move, that's the measure of our successful contribution to sustainable development. So if I just pick a few examples. So no poverty. So, well, poverty is not just about access to money, it also includes access to cultural property. Goal 2, zero hunger, includes a target on seed banks and crop plants and their wild relatives. Good health and well-being includes a target on well-being, which we all know that cultural participation, people getting together, is good for your health and well-being. Goal 4 includes a target which is all about education for sustainable development, which includes the recognition of the importance both of cultural diversity and the role of culture in sustainable development. And I could go through all 17 goals and easily do the same thing. But I know that like 17 goals, 169 targets sounds a bit too much. And so I spent a long time in 2019 thinking of a framework really that was a kind of shorthand into the sustainable development goals and how museums and their partners can contribute to them. And so I created this set of 7 activities, which I'll talk about in turn, which are, you can think about these either as like channels on a television, or you're, whether you get to know about the goals and targets or not doesn't actually matter, so long as you're doing these 6 things actually would mean that you were contributing to the goals and targets, and you can get this for free at the link. So I'll go through these in turn. So firstly is to be as concerned about the heritage outside of institutions as the heritage inside them. That should be okay to do. That you know, if we're concerned about culture and heritage, we should be concerned about it outside. But we should really look to adjust our professional standards and practices to meet the realities of climate action and sustainable development and what they need. because what we find at the moment is that cultural institutions can be rather slow to change, policies are slow to change. The aim is not that we get all of these things lined up by 2030. The aim is that the goals have been achieved. So that means we need to move much faster than we perhaps are, or than we are. Secondly is to use learning approaches that can support climate mitigation and adaptation and rights-based climate action. And there are two approaches which are really relevant. One of them is called Education for Sustainable Development. The other one is Global Citizenship Education. But we can think of applying them not only in public activities, but in our professional training and education as well. These should be really written into every course. Thirdly is to promote cultural participation for everyone. As we know, cultural institutions are often disproportionately visited by middle classes and high consumers, and that's really a reflection of the activities that the institutions provide. So if we want perhaps slightly different, I also don't really like talking about audiences, I prefer to talk about people. We should look at providing services that are more welcoming, more appropriate for people who are less well off. And we should perhaps, well, I'm sure we should shift towards localism rather than, as is often the case, cultural institutions measure success by how many international visitors they had. Perhaps if they focused on how many local visitors they had would be a more successful measure of sustainable development. A fourth one, so here we have an image of Venice, which, as is well known, suffers from what's called over-tourism. I mean, tourism, we tend to think of heritage as a generally a good thing, but it's also a driver of unsustainable tourism. So 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from tourism. It's absolutely a huge quantity. If it was a country, it would be third only to the US and to China. And we see that tourism is expanding enormously and projected to continue to expand. Heritage institutions could at least look not to be driving that in unsustainable tourism. And if they factored the emissions from their visitors into their thinking, they might think perhaps a bit more about how many international tourists they really want to attract. The fifth one would be around supporting research that supports climate mitigation and adaptation. Really making sure that collections are in a good condition, that they exist, that museums are open, that there are plenty of staff to facilitate visitors, that they are developed in an ongoing way, that collections don't just become a kind of aging document of the past, but also that we should look to share the results of research really widely and freely, because it's ultimately society's cultural heritage. We should make sure that it benefits from any research information that's derived from it. And we can also support a research-informed society, which, you know, in the context of the so-called post-truth era, it would be a very, very welcome. The sixth one is a huge topic around ensuring that every single decision, every single day is contributing to climate action. So if you find that you're doing the same things that you were doing a year ago or 2 years ago, there's a very good chance that you're not moving fast enough. We need to adapt our practices and our methods and the resources we're using to meet the realities of climate action. So when we find from one of the recent IPCC reports was that emissions need to reduce by roughly 7% every year between 2020 and 2030 to be on track for a 1.5 degrees world. If you are reducing by 7% each year, fantastic, well done. Please tell other people how you did it. Please make sure it's not just about net zero or offsetting, and please make sure it includes your scope 3 emissions. But lastly, to ensure, how prepared are you for climate impacts? Do you even know what they are going to be in your location? Who else might know? And how can you ensure that museums and collections and culture and heritage are not just going to survive in the short term, but are going to be able to thrive for the long term? And the last one would be to return to this importance of partnership, to familiarise yourself with the public-facing part of the Paris Agreement, because there is one, and to incorporate Agenda 2030 and the SDGs into your thinking and planning, how you can work with others and work with them more effectively. And so just to say using the goals can help museums and other cultural institutions to plan and deliver meaningful activities, put your resources to good use. And very importantly is to contribute to multiple agendas simultaneously. So the cultural sector often seems to kind of ping pong around between different issues and move from one thing to the next. Using the 17 goals in a holistic way can help you address multiple agendas at the same time. You can help you build partnerships and collaborations and demonstrate your value to society. And the way that I like to think about this is that museums and cultural institutions can help give Agenda 2030 and the SDGs reach. They reach huge, huge numbers of people. But Agenda 2030 and the SDGs can help give museums purpose. People look for purpose. Some of the principles of the agenda are around acknowledging that people are not empty vessels waiting to be filled. They have their own ideas, dreams, aspirations. They have rights around culture and cultural participation and the right to environmental decision making, many more, that museums and so on can help them, really experience in their own and daily lives. And I'll go a bit faster so I get through this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about disaster risk reduction, which, because it's International Disaster Risk Reduction Day, and because society is coming to grips with the horrendous COVID pandemic we've had and the really incredible consequences it's had. And actually COVID is a very good example of the interrelated aspect of the challenges we face in the world. What could be seen as a health problem very quickly became an economic and social problem, and it turns out is rooted in the way we are destroying the environment. Is also an environmental challenge. That's a sustainable development challenge. So disaster risk reduction is a tried and tested method, approach, which is really about looking at how to not just seek to get back to where you were before a disaster, but to use the rehabilitation and reconstruction periods to change, to make sure that you don't just end up back to square one. And disaster risk reduction and sustainable development are really closely related, and disaster risk reduction actually has some targets within the Sustainable Development Goals. And I wrote this guide last year to try to help museums and their partners to draw on these approaches, because they talk about the tension between the need to recover and the need to transform. As institutions try to get back on their feet, there's a danger that they make short-term decisions that close off options that would be very useful for the long term. And so the way that these things are connected is that in both sustainable development and activity and disaster risk reduction, we're trying to strengthen some things and reduce or eliminate others. We're trying to strengthen the positive aspects, the capacities, the knowledge, skills, resources, ideas, capabilities, which can include collections and collections-based knowledge. And resilience is an expression of capacity. We talk about three aspects of resilience: the ability to absorb, to adapt, or transform in the face of shocks. Excuse me. And we're trying to reduce these three negative aspects: the hazards, which are the sources of risk; the exposure, which is who's particularly exposed to hazards; and the vulnerability. So some groups, social groups, are more exposed to they're more likely to be impacted. And we can think about this as a kind of fraction. We're trying to increase the capacities and resilience and reduce the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And the extent to which we do these things is again a measure of successful sustainable development and disaster risk reduction. And so there's a model called the 10 Essentials of Resilience. It's been used since about 2005. It's used mostly by cities for resilient cities. But it can be, because of course most museums exist in cities, and it can be applied to museums not just to ensure that they contribute effectively in their town or city, but why not? Why not just learn from the approach? And so there are these 10 essentials, which I'll just go through quite quickly, which are around getting organized for disaster resilience. Who could contribute in your town, in your place, in your region to resilience building? Secondly, what are the likely risk scenarios? We might think about this in the terms of climate change. Like if you're in a low-lie in a museum on the coast, next to a river, in a place that's next to a big forest, in a place that's below a big cliff, in an isolated place on a small island, they all face different likely climate scenarios. Thirdly, we can make sure that we always budget for resilience. So any decisions that are taken around budget, they make sure that they're also helping build resilience. That resilience isn't something that's thought of as a project that you'll fundraise for one day, because you won't realize you need it until it's too late. We need to be prepared for these things. Fourth one is about pursuing resilient urban development, and we could think about that in relation to over-tourism. How many tourists does a museum need or a heritage site need to survive, and what would happen, as with COVID, if they didn't come? Because that creates disaster risk. The fifth one is about supporting nature to be able to protect us and protect itself. Sixth one is about ensuring staff and staff systems and organizational systems are effective for resilience. Having robust policies, training and so on in place. The seventh one is obviously around public engagement and cultural participation. So to make sure that everyone in our community is aware of the likely risks that they might face in their life, and how the museum and how cultural heritage can help them to meet or face those risks. The final three, increasing infrastructure resilience, ensuring preparedness and disaster response, and the last one is the source of this very overused phrase, build back better. Build back better is the same principle as disaster risk reduction. It's in its proper sense is sustainable development. It's making sure we build a more harmonious balance between considering human, natural and economic considerations. And so I have another of these guides will be released for COP26, is really to build on the previous one in a much more practical way, to use it as a kind of results framework to help you set goals, develop plans, monitor and communicate your sustainable development goals and actions. Just to mention, if you're looking for any tools around this, there's a really fantastic project from ICROM that I'm working as a consultant on, and we've developed an online toolkit that you can search for existing tools, and it aligns them up with the activities that cultural institutions do. You can search it in 4 ways, either through the 5 Ps across the top, by the actions, by a particular SDG, or by the particular targets at the bottom. There are 4 different entry points into the same body of tools. And please do use them, they're really fantastic tools. Just to mention briefly, Reimagining Museums for Climate Action is a project I've been working on for the last 1.5 years. It is headed up by Professor Rodney Harrison at University College London. and Colin Sterling, who's now at the University of Amsterdam. And we're really hoping that this can help inspire radical climate action, both in and with museums before, during and after COP26. We've got an exhibition at Glasgow Science Centre, which we worked on over the last year and a half with 8 teams from around the world. There's a website with about 70, 80 really good ideas that we hope will help inspire people. And we'll have a book and a practical toolkit will come out in November. And this is related to part of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which I mentioned earlier, is what COP is all about. Article 6 of the Framework Convention is about education, training, public awareness, public participation, access to information and international cooperation. And whenever I see that list of 6 things, it just kind of screams museums to me. And we had a decision taken at COP24 by governments that acknowledged the role of education and cultural institutions and museums in supporting these 6 aspects. Really fantastic. So just to mention, finally, this is our Glasgow Science Centre in the top left there, very fantastic futuristic looking building. And one of the 8 exhibits is looking at, well, what museums were small places that supported communities in addressing local climate challenges? And I just really love this image of one of their models looking across to what's called the Armadillo in Glasgow, which is where the COP will be held. So I'll end my talk there, and I'll stop this share. So thank you.
Thank you, Henry. That was really interesting. That was a very thorough it was a very thorough talk, very thorough presentation, really interesting, as I say, and one of the clearest explanations of what the issues are, where we are, and what we can do. So thank you very much. We have one question in the chat, and I would ask people to add their questions. They're now starting to come through. So I'll start with the first question that we've got, which is, are fluorine gases emitted by air conditioning and environmental control systems?
So the way that they would be emitted would be either at the end of their life, when they're disposed of. So it's really important that they're disposed, and the same with refrigeration units. It's really important that they're disposed of in safe ways. So yeah, I think they are.
So what is the process for disposal then?
So that would be to make sure that you contact your waste management company. In the way, so when you see a fridge left at the side of the road, as that does sometimes happen, is really poor. We just need to make sure that we understand the source of these gases, and we make sure that we do everything we can. So for instance, we might think about, well, do we really need all of these refrigeration units in the first place? That's a big discussion, big conversation. But yeah, that's where the gases come from. They come from refrigeration units.
As I say, listening to the radio this morning, they're talking about the global issues around shipping. And they were saying that the cost of shipping a refrigerator from China was £20 last year. This year it's £160, which is added on to the price of a fridge or a freezer. So actually they're going to be getting a lot more expensive, and hopefully, that's my take on it anyway, is that will push people into refurbing and to keep them longer. However, I know there are also issues with that with refrigeration units also.
Yeah, so I mean, that would be a good example of because it's really very easy to understand the economic cost of something. It's extremely hard to know the social or environmental cost. But like if we think about, like the waste hierarchy, the best option is just not to buy them in the first place.
Yeah.
Just reduce the use in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. So we're getting lots of thanks on the chat.
Yeah, lots of very nice comments.
Thought-provoking, and it certainly is really thought-provoking. I'm just reading the one that's just come through. This is the question that I was thinking about as well. So much of the work to convince decision makers to change practice is not about providing facts, but to reach a deeper deeper into often emotion-based decision-making, how can we become better at nudging for the purpose of achieving better decisions?
Yeah, so personally, I think it doesn't just come down to nudging, because if nudging is going for a kind of emotional, value-based, it's also relatively easy to nudge someone in the opposite direction. So if I could kind of draw attention to, like if we say how the big museums report on their carbon emissions, they talk about some of their scope 3 emissions, but they don't talk about others. So they talk about business travel, but they don't include visitor travel. And so visitor attractions, attracting lots of people, those visitors, their emissions are at least partly the responsibility of the institutions. So I think there is also a bit of shining a light, because, so say when we talk about emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, it sounds really, really mysterious. But then when people are talking about, so yeah, someone said there about staff travel. Staff travel is quite often measured when people talk about their emissions. Visitor travel is almost certainly much bigger. So yeah, so what do I think there? So let's go with, so say the rush that a lot of institutions have made in the last couple of years to declare emergencies. So it would be great to see more of the organizations that have declared emergencies to be coming back with what they've done. What have they done to address their, because this, I think this is part of the worry about nudging and so on. If it just becomes like very emotionally driven, that doesn't necessarily lead to action, because it might just like hijack people for a short time. But then if it doesn't lead to real change, we need to see real change. Yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, I agree with you there. So we have another question, which is, there are many conflicting demands on the staff volunteer resource. One of the major problems is that they are simply not staffed to do any of this work, as core staff costs are very underfunded. And they're saying they would appreciate some suggestions about advocating for extra staff to actually do some of this important work.
Yeah, okay. So how would I answer that? Let's think of the slightly perverse situation where we have, and I'll talk about the growth model and return to that. So we have the perverse situation where we have huge organizations spending a huge amount of money on really big exhibitions to attract high consuming visits, people who already have a high carbon footprint. They could easily, and also at the same time saying they have no money for staff. We could kind of cut through that quite easily by saying, well, actually, small is beautiful, like Schumacher's book, small is beautiful. If we think back to the even 20, 30, 40 years ago, there were many more local museums than there are now. They've become very centralized. And we see often the way that museums develop is really a kind of museum that is very unsustainable in that way of this unsustainable production and consumption of museums. So why don't we see, like in the example I gave from Glasgow, what if museums were just like a tent? What if they were just like a tent? That you gave the community a tent. You didn't really needed to have all of these things and environmental conditions that just make it completely impossible for them to borrow anything, or or they have materials that don't need those things. And if you had this network of these tiny museums, many more people could experience cultural participation in a very sustainable way. that doesn't require them to travel miles into a town to see their own supposedly cultural heritage when they can't really see it. They can see it through a glass case, you know, and under someone else's terms in a great big gas guzzling building. And so the point there about underfunding and staff. So I mentioned that like in the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the goals is around work. And it talks, I can't remember the exact phrase now, but it talks about it might be decent, safe and inclusive work. Now, it would be so lovely to think of a cultural sector that valued decent work.
Yeah. And
I don't mean just like, we think about go back to this point I'm making about places that spend a fortune on huge, big exhibitions, a good chunk of which probably goes in the skip. Meanwhile, they just don't value people. And I mean, you know, it seems a bit difficult for me to understand how you can say that you're valuing the visitors if you are valuing the visitors while you're not valuing the staff, because they are also people. And yeah, so I would really recommend people have a look into that. So there's two things to this. One of them is from the International Labour Organization, is called the Decent Work Agenda. And the other one is to have a look at a thing called the UN Global Compact. So because like the cultural sector so often talks about how it's trusted and it's valued and all these nice, you know, warm things, the corporate sector has not enjoyed that level of public trust. So it has faced much greater scrutiny. And so, like, if you look at corporate CSR reporting, corporate social responsibility reporting has been around in the commercial sector for decades, for 30, 40 years. It's actually much better at reporting on it than museums are. And so, like, the UN Global Compact is it's 10 principles of the framework of the UN Global Compact, which are around making sure that you aren't complicit in human rights abuses, that you value the environment, that you value staff. And I'd really just encourage people to become familiar with that as well. Because I think the more that we can understand everyone's rights, our own rights, communities' rights, people's rights, we could bring in Indigenous rights. You know, all of these things already exist, but the cultural sector is often rather unaware of them. Knowledge is power.
I feel we could have this conversation for several more hours yet, but I've got one eye on the time and we've run over already. So is there anything else, any final words that you'd like to add?
Yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch with me with a question, that's fine. I'm happy to answer that. So what's on here? Henry, cultural heritage organisations are often government funded and many use events to increase their funding. We should look at event emissions for sure. But yeah, this project funding model, like if we look from a rights-based approach, all of the countries signed up to the Universal Declaration, and whenever it was, 1948, I think, something like that. If people remembered, you know, if we just talked about these things more, we'd have more of a chance of them being a reality, rather than talking about, very often the cultural sector seems to get a bit hypnotized by money. If you look in for instance, reviews of exhibitions and so on, very often the first thing it will say is how much it cost.
Yeah.
And that should be seen to be a bad thing rather than a good thing. If something costs a fortune, should be seen to be a bad thing, I think. We should be looking, like, it should be how much was reused? How much did it make a difference for people who don't have so much? Like, so I did a webinar recently, and I was asking people, of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which goals do you think you could support? and nobody thought they could support poverty. And then if we think of a world with poverty and hunger, which are like arguably the biggest wastes of human potential and, quality of life. If we think about the scale of these challenges, but then what cultural institutions focus their efforts on, it seems a bit crazy. Yeah, that's a story for another day. But
I can say that this is the 2 hour long, now you have a 2 hour long or even longer conversation. But thank you very much. I mean, it's been a really, really interesting talk, and I agree with all of the comments that you've been getting in the chat. It's been really thought provoking, really in depth. We've given people tools that they can take away and use. So thank you very much for that. So one final thing. Thank you. One final thing on the Environmental Sustainability Network. Our next event is a joint event, a panel discussion with the AIC and the Institute of Conservation Environmental Sustainability Network on the 3rd of November. And that's scheduled for 6 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. So we'll be sending out the details for that soon for people to be able to sign up to come along to that. It will be free to everybody, for members and non-members, so everybody is welcome. But once again, Henry, thank you very much, and thank you for your time and your knowledge, and it's been really useful.
Yeah, can I add one, sorry, just a speaker's privilege thing. Mm-hmm. That people talk so much about COP26 and what will the governments do and so on. But let's not forget that there are a lot of things that we can all do. Institutions have tons of privilege, and they can just use it. Climate change can't just be put in the hands of governments because they are the weak link in the chain, I'm afraid. It's like working with communities, working with our organizations. What do they want us to do? What can we do locally? That's how change will happen.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.